Hello and welcome back to Thursday Night Football Slate Breakdown. We got the Broncos versus the Saints this week. And now this game isn't the most exciting one to watch, but I do think it is actually pretty interesting for the single game contest because there's so many different avenues to go this week with all the injuries. So I think this show in particular is going to be more of a fun one. A lot of different ways and different strategy things we can talk about, and we're going to get into it all. But before we do, come join us at LineStar. One of the easiest way to try us out, if you have never used us before, 7-day free trial through the app stores, Android or iOS app store. You get 7 free days. Try us out. Why not? What do you got to lose? Now, let's get into it. Let's see how this slate breaks down and get into it position by position. It is a 37 game total. Game is in New Orleans. They are 2.5 road dogs to the Broncos. What in the world is going on? But in the quarterback spot, really the story of the Saints is just how beat up they are. Their O-line is beat up. Taysom Hill has been out for 2 games. He might be back. He did practice and limited this week. Then you have Kamara banged up. They are likely without Shaheed and Olave. It's just not great times for the health of the New Orleans Saints. That is why they are underdogs at home. Now, Spencer Rattler, he showed some upside last week. 243 yards passing, added a little rushing with 27 yards, 1 TD, 2 interceptions. I think he's in a fine spot. He is versus a very, very tough defense in the Broncos, though, and that is the big story here. However, I do have to add in that Patrick Surtain is likely going to be out for the Broncos, which will make that defense a little bit worse. I don't mind going to Rattler. I like him as a prospect, but I think this week might be a little bit tough for him for the reason being that his pass catchers are all, wide receiver 3, 4, 5, and then they, the slew of tight ends and Alvin Kamara. So they don't have quite the weapons on offense they normally do, and that O-line is beat up. One guard is going to be out. The other one has been did not practice on Monday, Tuesday. I don't know about today if they practiced. And then you also have a center that didn't practice Monday and then was limited on Tuesday. So their O-line is beat up. There's a lot of reasons to not like this spot for Rattler. But, it's a single game contest, and I wouldn't be that surprised in a low-scoring game if he is optimal. I do prefer Bo Nix, who we're going to talk about now. Bo Nix is coming off 3 of 4 contests where he's put up 19-plus fantasy points. He has rushing upside, went for 61 rushing yards last week, had a rushing touchdown the week before that. 2 weeks before that, 47 yards and a rushing touchdown. So there is some upside with Bo Nix. He's also getting better and getting more comfortable throwing the football. 33 attempts last week, 2 touchdowns, 216 yards. 27 attempts the week before, 206 yards and 2 touchdowns. He has games of, mid-30s or even low 40s in attempts. So Sean Payton is letting him spread the ball around, and the offense is getting a little bit healthier. I think Bo Nix is an interesting spot. I do prefer him over Spencer Rattler, but I think both quarterbacks are firmly in play. If we go over to the matchup report, Bo Nix does have the better matchup. He is about average, league average matchup with 14th versus QB for New Orleans. Whereas Spencer Rattler, it shows the Broncos being 3rd versus QB. I do have to remind you that Surtain is likely going to be out, so Spencer Rattler is in a little bit better of a spot, but probably not a ton. Now, getting back to the positions, let's get into the running back spot. So Javonte Williams and Alvin Kamara, those are the two ones we really got to talk about. Javonte, so the last 4 games, the Saints have given it up to running back. 141 rushing yards per game, 51 receiving yards per game, 1.3 touchdowns per game. They just got torched by Tampa Bay on the ground or by the running back. Generally not something that's going to happen with the Saints. They are stout versus the run. However, they have given it up lately, and I think Javonte is a little bit interesting. My worry is he has a ceiling of 16. We have him projected for 67% ownership right now. If this guy is not putting up mid-teens, I would say it's unlikely that he ends up being in an optimal lineup. So I do worry about his upside. And for that reason, I side with Alvin Kamara, for the reason being his floor is like 16. The lowest he's done this year is in KC, where he put up 13. Outside of that, he had a game of 16 versus Philly, 17 versus Tampa Bay, and then it's mid-20s or higher. Now, I think this is a tough matchup for him, but it is going to be easier to run or use the running back on the Broncos or use the tight end than the receivers in this matchup, especially with all the injuries. So I would expect for a stack box versus Kamara, but there should be enough dump-off passes from Rattler to make Alvin Kamara still usable. He still had 8 targets last week. If he's getting 8 targets again, his floor is still in that 13, 15 point range. And while his price is up, I really don't worry about the price on this slate just because there's so many injuries and different ways you can go to attack this slate. So I kind of think Alvin Kamara is just kind of a must use. Now, outside of Kamara, Jaleel McLaughlin got a ton of hype over the summer that he could be, really used. How it's broken down is he's playing 25 to 30% of the snaps. He's had a couple games of like 9 touches. Outside of that, it's usually 7 or less. I don't see a ton of upside in this spot, but he is used a little bit in the red zone. He's used a little in the passing game. They do different things with him. He's at least worthy of some roster consideration and having a little bit of if you're making a ton of rosters. I don't love the play, but you absolutely need to consider him. Then I think Kendre Miller is a very interesting one. It is expected that he's going to be back this week. Jamal Williams only played 4% of snaps last week. So they really pulled back on Jamal Williams, which I think opens the door wide open for that RB2 spot. And I would not be surprised whatsoever if Kendre Miller takes it. They drafted him for a reason a few years ago. He hasn't done much, but they've talked highly about him in practice and he's shown some flashes. So I think as a punt option at 2,400 and low owned, he is absolutely interesting. Jamal Williams, I'm totally off. I think he's dust. I don't think he's any good. And even when he's got run this year, he hasn't done anything with it. He would have to fall into the end zone pretty much to be optimal. Audrey Estime, he's not getting the touches. Without injury, I doubt he's in a perfect lineup. Michael Burton is at least playing a little bit, but once again, not really an issue. Now, getting over to the matchup tool. Javonte Williams. Saints have been 31st versus running back. Javonte's in a decent spot. Just worry about his floor. Then you have Alvin Kamara in pretty much a league average spot. I don't mind going to Kamara, and even with the matchup differences, with ownership differences, I would rather go to Kamara than Javonte. I just worry about Javonte's ceiling. Javonte, because of Bo Nix's rushing ability, may not always be used in the red zone, and that worries me because that is really how he could hit a ceiling. Without that red zone work, I don't think we see a ceiling number out of him. He really needs a touchdown to become optimal. All right, getting into the wide receiver. Now, this is where things really become interesting because we got a lot to cover. Chris Olave, concussion last week. Rashid Shaheed has a knee injury that the team is saying is worrisome. No more data has come out about it yet, but I would say it's doubtful he plays. So then you have Cedric Wilson, who's been the wide receiver 3 all season long. Mason Tipton, who has been the wide receiver 4 all season long, and then Bub Means. Now, the most interesting thing about all of this, when Chris Olave went out, Bub Means is the one that played the most. He played 70% of snaps last week. He was the wide receiver, 5? And then Cedric Wilson, his snap count really didn't go up. It stayed about the same. He was right around 50%, and Mason Tipton was at like 40%. Now, I would expect Cedric Wilson to kind of take that RB2 role or WR2 role, and then Tipton to stay in a wide receiver 3 role. So Bub Means, I think, is actually very interesting. He showed some rapport with Rattler. He had 8 targets, 5 receptions, 45 yards, and a touchdown. He's a guy that he's 6'1" or 6'2", ran a 4.40, so he's like 215 pounds. So he's a big athletic guy, and he's now getting a shot. I am absolutely interested in him, and he probably would be my highest owned receiver, especially if Surtain is out this week. So I think Bub Means is very interesting, but if the ownership stays like this, where Tipton's 1,600 and 25% owned, and Cedric Wilson is 3,200 and only 11% owned, it's very interesting to go with a Tipton or a Cedric Wallace over Bub Means, just because we really don't know how the Saints are going to game plan it. Last week, they didn't have a game plan for Olave only playing 4% of the snaps. So it is going to be a little bit interesting. I do like Bub Means because they didn't have that game plan and he still became a thing. I think that he is going to be game planned into this, and then it really becomes what are the roles of Tipton and Wilson. They're going to have to use them. What we've seen from Wilson over the last years is, he's okay. He can get open. He can have, some success, but he's not a wide receiver too. And so that's my worry with him, is that he's just going to kind of stay who he is and may not have much upside, even with target volume going up. Now, on the Broncos side, we have stuff to talk about as well. Devon Vele. So he has been out since week 1. He had 8 targets week 1, only 8 receptions for 39 yards, but he had 8 targets. Came back, had 6 targets. So he's averaging 7 targets a game. He is obviously a preferred option for Bo Nix. We also have Josh Reynolds, who missed last week and could be out once again this week. So I think Vele is very, very interesting. The alpha in the room is absolutely Courtland Sutton. And this Broncos team just hasn't had much of an upside on offense, but Sutton is the preferred option. He's averaging 7.8 targets a week, 46 yards. He has 2 touchdowns. There's definitely path to Sutton's success, and he is the alpha on the team. Absolutely do not mind playing him. It really comes down to touchdown or bust for him, but hey, that's the showdown game in general. I do like Sutton. Little Jordan Humphrey, he took a big hit last week. I was expecting him to play a lot more. His snap count really fell with Vele coming back. And the interesting thing is that Troy Franklin's snap count shot up. Troy Franklin is absolutely interesting. He played with Bo Nix in Oregon. He got his first real chance at playing time last week, had 3 targets. They also gave him a carry. He had 31 yards and a touchdown. because they played in college, I have a little more faith in him, even though he only had 3 targets. They already have that rapport. I'm interested in him. Do I really like him? No. But I think he is going to play opposite Cortland Sutton, with Vele playing a lot of the slant. And I'm very much interested in Troy Franklin, especially if he is 16% owned. Then Marvin Mims, he's there, but not doing much, and I wouldn't expect that to change this game. And the obvious 4 is Jordan Humphrey. With Vele being there, I just don't see much upside. And at 2K, he's probably priced a little high in a lower volume passing attack. Now, getting over to the wide receiver spot, Cedric Wilson in a better spot than Sutton. I do have to say, though, that Cedric Wilson isn't going to have to deal with Surtain, so that spot is a little bit worse, or a little bit better. Troy Franklin is in a decent spot, and Bub Means is in a great spot, as well as Vele. Now, getting over to the tight end position. This is another spot that is interesting. So, Juwan Johnson is a smaller tight end. He's only 6'3", like 235 or something like that. With all of the injury concerns on the wide receiver side for the Saints, I wouldn't be that surprised if he played a little bit more and played more of like a slot role. And so I think he is extremely interesting at low ownership in this game. He's only 7,800. He could be used a ton. After Kamara, he has the second most targets on the team, which will be active this week. Olave and Shaheed are obviously well above him, but then it's Kamara and Juwan Johnson. I'm absolutely interested in Juwan Johnson. Another aspect that we don't have him in right now just because he's been out the last 2 games, and that is Taysom Hill. Taysom Hill is kind of a wild card, and with all the injuries, I would expect him to be more involved on this team if he plays on Thursday. Absolutely very interesting. Foster Morneau is, tight end 2. He's going to play a lot, and if Juwan Johnson moves, to the slot a little bit more, it means Foster is going to play a lot, and there's definitely upside. 54 yards last week. The week before, had 13 yards and a touchdown. Week 1, 43 yards and a touchdown. So he has a path to success. I don't mind playing him. I think he's cheap enough. I think the tight ends on the Saints are very, very interesting. There is absolutely a path to success in this contest where you don't even need a wide receiver. You could probably fill out a lineup with running backs, defense, kicker, tight ends, and quarterback, and not use any tight ends at all, or not use any wide receivers at all, and be optimal. So I think tight ends are key this week. Now, getting over to the Broncos side, Lucas Krill played 60% of the snaps last week. He had 4 targets. Week before, he only played, sparingly, but it's an interesting spot versus the Saints, who haven't been great versus tight end. If he plays 60% again, there's definitely some upside, especially at 1K. Troutman is going to play a ton, or he's going to play 40, 50%, but he's just really not a pass-catching tight end, so I don't love the outlook for Troutman or Nate Atkins for that, even though Atkins at least does have a target and a reception the last couple weeks. And Troutman, we have as, a great spot versus the Saints tight end. I would have to say Lucas Krill is the one that would be the biggest beneficiary from that. Also, Juwan Johnson is a good spot versus the Broncos. The Broncos' weakness has been stopping the tight end. So I think Juwan is absolutely interesting this week. And let's dig into defense, kicker real quick. The game total's 37. Defense is 100% in play. Both defenses are solid, but the Broncos defense is very solid, and they're only 4,800. So I'm absolutely interested in the Broncos, especially with all the wide receiver injuries the Saints have. So I think Broncos are a great play, and I cannot believe they're only 24% owned. Saints, I'm absolutely fine with using them as well. There's definitely upside there. Kicker-wise, the one thing I need to say about using kickers today is most likely that these ownerships on the kickers are low, and they're going to end up being higher owned than what they are. The one thing I need to say about kicker is they are game scoring dependent. If you have a game that is lower scoring, the chance of them really being needed is a lot less. You would need the situation that teams are able to move the ball consistently, but then just get touchdowns, so they're kicking field goals. So you're still looking at, needing, 5-6 scoring drives, something like that, to really be needed in a game. And I think that it might be hard for these offenses to really have 5 or 6 scoring drives. Now, scoring drive does take into account, touchdowns or field goals. So I just think it is unlikely that either of these teams are able to create that many drives. Now, there could be 3 or 4, absolutely. Now, then you're just rolling the dice on how far are those field goals. If they're 40, 50 yards, you don't need that many for one of these guys to be optimal. But I think the chances of them being optimal just drops a little bit when the position is so dependent on the offenses being able to move the ball. You have 2 offenses that, the Broncos at least, that has not been very good, hasn't been very efficient, hasn't really been able to move the ball. And then you have a Saints offense that is just totally decimated with injuries, likely has trouble to move the ball. So that is the one thing I want to say about kicker. Definitely both will be in my player pool, but I worry about them really being optimal a little bit. So that'll do it for us today, guys. A little longer one than normal just because we had a lot to go over, but I hope you guys found this worthy and gave you a little bit value. But please like, comment, and subscribe to the video. I'll be back later this week with more. Peace!